Okay, I found my starting place. I think I got through most of it last week and ended up where I needed to be. And well, I thought maybe we could move on, but then I got to looking in Naomi Rosenblatt's book, The Wrestling with Angels, What the First Family of Genesis Teaches Us About Our Spiritual Identity, Sexuality, and Personal Relationships. Now, the Joseph story is full of spiritual identity, sexuality, and personal relationships. And she had some interesting reflections that I thought would be worthy of our time and not just blow right by them. And they're some different, but somewhat close to some of the other things that we had said, but I thought it would be helpful. So, she also went into the psychological and some of the maturation processes that she could, from her role as a psychoanalyst, was either reading into the story or perceiving coming out of the story. So you could interpret it either way. But anyway, some interesting reflections. She opens with a quote from Ben Jonson. Anybody know Ben Jonson? No. An old Ben Jonson, a contemporary of Shakespeare. You remember him? Well, I made the mistake in college taking 2 English courses. One of them was a course on Shakespeare and at the same time on Ben Jonson. And I thought, well, the same time period, the same kind of background. What I did not realize, I should have spent more time going to get counseling with, academic advisors. These plays with all of the characters and all the weird names. It did. It just got all jumbled up, and I didn't do well because I got confused. The different plots, they were similar, but was it in this one, and was this character there? And anyway, it was a nightmare. But I did like some of Ben Jonson's works. He had, I remember one of his plays that the main characters were a true wit and a would-be. Now, true wit was a character who really knew himself and was himself and, had good qualities. The would-be was a pleaser and a person who tried to fake it a lot to appear to be something he wasn't. And so he failed miserably because people could see through his sham and so forth. But anyway, true wit and would-be. I've used those names to describe some folks that I thought were would-bes. As I've encountered them. Sometimes today we call them plastic people. But anyway, they just conform and manipulate themselves to kind of fit in wherever they want to be accepted, but yet they're not really themselves. You can't tell who they are and so forth. Anyway, she opens with this quote from Ben Jonson, who wrote, "He knows not his own strength that has not met adversity." In other words, we will never know our own strengths until we face some great test or terrible trial. And then she points out that it's human nature for us to avoid the obstacles and to take the easy route and to spare ourselves unhappiness and heartache And that seems reasonable. Why would you do things the hard way and put yourself through a lot of unpleasantness? However, most of my life, since I can't go to the gym and don't have time to work out and the cool down time, I have done things the hard way on yard work, because I made the yard work my exercise. And I had one of those star edgers, you push it. That was my upper body exercise. I wore that sucker out. And I tried to get a replacement. They don't make them like they used to. The darn thing would bend because the steel wasn't strong enough. It was so frustrating. Anyway, I've given up, and I've gotten one of those. You charge the battery and you zzz, and do it quick. But she points out that in human nature we try to avoid the hard things. And sometimes people will do that in such a way, and it's frustrating. They say in their own minds, well, I didn't really fail because I didn't really try. And so avoiding the failure, so not really engaging and trying hard. And she says often parents try to spare their children the pains of the harsh realities of life by being overly protective. I heard a piece not just last week or so on NPR affirming what Rosenblatt was saying here, and then I looked in the cover, and this was published in 1995, so that was 20 years ago. She was saying this, but this report on NPR was current, and it was saying that so often parents do protect their children so much that they don't build the strength and self-assurance to face problems and face failures and overcome them and so forth. But the problem of the overprotection, and David will speak to it in his sermon today, is the news media has broadcast so many dangers that are possible. And, we realize those things, and so we don't want to be that parent, that 1 in a million who has that bad thing happen to our child because we thought, well, go out there and get tough. But anyway, it's very, very difficult. But then to overcome a lot of that and to be so overly protective against the overzealous sports programs, I mean, we have these little tiny, like kindergartners out there learning to play soccer, and people yelling at them to be, the superstar, so that to take the edge off of it and try to make it fun. I know when Bobby was starting that way back, and he's 18 now, they had this thing, well, we're not going to keep score, and we're not going to list who are the winners. But, these little kids are picking it up from their parents, and they know the score. They're keeping count, and, if they got more points than the other team, yay, we won! But yet, that over-competitiveness, and then I got Bobby in, this little football stuff when he was 2nd or 3rd grade, just to be the camaraderie of the sports and not be the left out thing. But I wasn't going to be big pushing, but what I noticed was that all the coaches had sons that were pretty good athletes, and the coaches concentrated on, well, the first year we had a really good coach, and things went well, and they won. The next year, his kid was younger, and so he stayed down, but most of the others, were a year older, so they moved up. So all these other coaches were out there, and every one of them was focusing on the potential stars. And all the other kids that were just out there, they ignored. And I noticed they were ignoring Bobby. And so I started, trying to step in and help him do things and try to help some of the other kids that weren't the stars. And but I saw that. So anyway, to counteract that kind of craziness, and the outcome of it, every one of those superstars fizzled out and hasn't done anything. They didn't become the high school football stars. And some of them, their dad ruined them. They hated the sport after a while. But anyway, in this trying to overcome that, nobody's a winner and nobody's a loser, and everybody gets a trophy. Well, what this is saying is, the thing on NPR was saying there has been so much of that, and so protecting kids from hardship and disappointment and failures, that so many kids are really afraid to leave the nest and go out into the world because it's too scary. They haven't experienced those tough challenges and learned, I can handle it. I can get knocked down and I can pick myself back up. And so it's creating, has created somewhat of a problem. Then I heard another one that was a medical one, in that we've been so overprotective with, the antibacterial and antivirus hand cleaners, and we clean the house so much and all of that the environment for some kids is so clean that their immune system doesn't have anything to work against, and there are more autoimmune diseases cropping up. And kind of the end of it, you're saying jokingly, well, no, practically, let the kids go out in the backyard and play in the dirt. Just let them be out there. And then jokingly said, it might not be too bad an idea just once a month to give them a teaspoonful of dirt. Well, this is the point that Rosenblatt was saying is that there is a time in our development that we are ready to mature and to begin to make the transition from childhood into adolescence in preparation for our adult responsibilities in the real world. And that we need to have those real tests and trials to learn from and to overcome and to build character and to build inner strength as we suffer through and overcome some of these things. That gets to Joseph, and she analyzes that Jacob had sheltered and pampered little Joseph, his special little child that was going to be his favorite, the love child of his favorite wife, who finally overcame her barrenness and conceived and gave birth to a child. So for Joseph, having been in this protected, sheltered environment, now his trials and tribulations were going to become a blessing. They were going to help him gain character and wisdom and understand inner strength and give himself confidence to become what he needed to become in God's plan. Rosenblatt suggested that his rude awakening to life's realities when his brothers betrayed him, that experiencing their hate and their jealousy as they stripped him of his fancy robe and threw him into the cistern. And she suggests further that he probably could hear his brothers debate. What are we going to do with him? Some are saying, kill him. Others are saying, just let him die there. And then the discussion about, well, maybe we could sell him. What is he worth? What is he worth? And, ends up 20 pieces of silver. How did he feel about that? How did he process all of that? And then to be carried off, and none of his brothers come running after. I changed my mind, and try to buy him back. That didn't happen. And then she suggests that he may have not been able to understand the language of those people who had bought him. Now, that may or may not have been the case. If his brothers were able to do business with them, there must have been some level of communication, but possibly the language that they were talking on their way might have been a different language, and that he wouldn't know. There may have been a common exchange language that everybody could kind of use. But anyway, that loneliness and that sense of isolation that he would have felt as he was taken down to Egypt. And we don't know whether Rosenblatt said as he was riding a camel, I'm not sure that they would have put him on a camel. He may have had to walk. But if they wanted to keep him, he might not have been broken in very well. He may have had rather delicate skin, and they wanted to keep him looking good so they could get a better price when they got down to Egypt. So maybe he was carted off on a camel. But he went from being his father's pet to becoming a piece of merchandise, chattel in the slave trade. And then when he's bought by Potiphar, this pampered boy becomes a house slave, and we understand pecking orders within systems. He would have started out having to do the dirtiest, nastiest jobs when he first got there, and no special treatment. But these were learning experiences. These were the hardships that tested him to see what he was made of. And he had to learn survival skills. If he had just been a totally spoiled brat and didn't cooperate and try to learn, he would have been beaten within an inch of his life, or just cast off and sold to work in the mines or to work in the fields. He couldn't have stayed in the household of Potiphar. So he had to be learning something in that process. Now, Rosenblatt stresses the point of the trials and tribulations can make you strong, but not automatically. Another factor plays a big role, she suggests, and that is a strong sense of self. A strong sense of self. That one has to have an inner sense of self that will remain intact in spite of all the assaults and challenges that the outside world is putting on you or forcing on you. He does not let the outward circumstances completely define him. He maintains some sense of self and self-definition. And so he can hold on to that no matter what life will be dealing him. And so as a psychologist, she's reading that into the story. because she works with a lot of people who may have been abused and experienced, a lot of really bad stuff. And some are broken, and some can survive. And what makes the difference? And she suggests it's some inner core. So we know that Joseph was fortunate to be of good appearance, and that he may have learned some interpersonal graces and manners in his mother and father's home, because they were grooming him to be a special child, and to maybe to be the favored child, and to take over the clan. He might have been going to be their little prince. And so they were teaching him different manners and so forth of how to get along and how to behave in the upper levels of the culture, which would have translated in how to behave, what kinds of graces and things need to happen within Potiphar's house. So he may have been blessed by that early nurture and teachings that then became a blessing and helped him survive in Potiphar's house. Now, that was a new thought that didn't that we hadn't covered before. So possibly those gifts and graces influenced Potiphar to believe that Joseph would make a good house slave and servant, and then allowed him to rise in responsibilities over others. But that same attractive appearance then made him appealing to Potiphar's wife, we assume. Rosenblatt suggests that this story is very timely today, in her day, in 1995, because even in 95, she points out more and more women are making their way into the workplace and levels of management, making the sexual dynamic, working together at equal levels in the workplace, sometimes traveling together on business trips, and collaborating intensely on big projects, having to work overtime and so forth, all can lead to feelings of intimacy between men and women that can easily trip over into sexual feelings, and then can lead to crossing over the boundaries of appropriate language and action, and then either be elements of harassment or coercion can enter into those equations. Then she suggests that this tale about Joseph is interesting, since more and more workplace structures have women in the power positions over male subordinates. And so historically, men have been the perpetrators crossing boundaries, but pop culture is exposing more and more the other way. I don't know if I've ever met one, but in the pop media they talk about these cougar women. Anybody know one of those persons? It's an aggressive middle-aged female that's going after younger men, sometimes in the workplace. Anybody heard of that? Cougar. Anybody heard of that? Is that a real thing? We don't have any of those in our church, do we? Anyway, I think it's just mythology but anyway. But there have been accounts of women high school teachers charged with statutory rape. And the reason it's rape is because they are in a power position over the male students, and therefore any boundary crossing, they're the responsible or irresponsible guilty party, and therefore subject to the charge. Anyway, so the young Joseph, we still understand him probably fairly young at this stage. We don't know if he's actually a minor, but still fairly young, and is pursued by Potiphar's wife, and then accused of attempted rape, and is somewhat a contemporary sort of situation. But the situation for Joseph went from bad to worse. It was one of those damned if you do and damned if you don't situations that is so very complicated, and you're just trapped. Anyway, Rosenblatt points out the irony of Joseph being stripped of his fancy robe and sold into slavery when he really hadn't done anything terribly wrong, not a capital offense. And now again he is stripped of his garment by Potiphar's wife, and then is again thrown down into prison, as it were. And she looks at the symbolism of one shedding one's skin time and again, as he descends lower and lower from the favored son to the house slave into prison. But this stripped of the garment, like shedding of a skin, if we look at it as symbolism as a snake molting its skin, shedding its skin, enabled to grow. The snake has to shed its skin in order to grow. So with that image and metaphor, she's saying he is growing through these processes. And so in order to grow, he has to put off the old and grow something new. And it's an interesting concept and an analogy that she's picked up. We could say she read it into the text, or she drew it out of the text. And she reminds us that the Bible displays a continual concern with abuse of power. And according to the Bible, whoever possesses political, economic, and social power over another or over others has the responsibility to exercise that power ethically and with compassion. Of course, we've got the whole Exodus story, and the God of the Hebrew people can be defined as the God who frees slaves. I mean, if you're going to summarize it, it's the God who frees slaves. But she points out in the book of Deuteronomy that there are so many regulations about the relationships between masters and slaves and so forth that have to do with the proper use of power position over the subordinates, and that there was always a place of where a slave, after 7 years of service, could then gain freedom. You know, like Jacob working 7 years for Leah and Rachel was an example of that indentured slavery, that one always had the possibility of freedom, which meant the slave was a human being and should be treated as such. And the servant role was not an identity, it was a temporary position or situation. We remember Joseph was an ambitious young man who probably expected to one day rule his father Jacob's tribe over his brothers because of the dream and because of this pampering. And like we said, the robe was one of an overseer, an authority robe. It wasn't a work robe that his father had given him. And then he sent him out wearing that robe. So he's kind of wearing the uniform or the badge of authority, which his brothers resented. But under his servant, slave, prisoners roles, his ambition had to adjust to a radically new and a different condition. And his strength of character begins to develop under the harsh conditions of this powerlessness. He had to develop other ways of negotiating for the things he needed and desired. From the power and authority position and privilege position, you just state what you want and it's delivered to you. Your wish is my command, sir. Now he's on the other side. Someone wishes, and that's a command to him to provide. So he was needing to develop other ways of negotiating for the things he needed and desired. A core value that he developed and finds strength in Potiphar's house is this virtue of self-restraint that Rosenblatt suggests is such a vital virtue one must develop. Now, we don't know how attractive Potiphar's wife was, or may have been, or on the other hand, we don't know how lonely and love-starved Joseph might have been, but he resisted her sexual advances and he exercised self-restraint. Another temptation he resisted was to win, rather than the sexual part, he might have been tempted to go along with her thinking this would be advantageous to him. That if he gave her what she was wanting, then she might give him other special treatment and favors within the household. And maybe gain some more power or influence or something that way. However, the risk would be her boredom and her unpredictability of her wants and desires. If one is ruled by wants and desires, then those can go every which way and turn on and turn off with no rhyme or reason. So he probably could recognize that reality, but the other reality is that one whose behavior and decisions are driven by their physical hungers and desires instead of being controlled by one's ethical or moral standards and one's reasoning abilities, they are more likely to be untrustworthy and unpredictable. And if he's gaining wisdom in this process and how to survive, he's probably understanding that. And that's another reason to, no thanks. I don't want to get tangled up in this. But he expresses it as a moral standard. It's not right. I have a relationship with your husband of honor and trust, and I don't want to violate that. And besides that, my God and I have a relationship, and I'm going to honor that by staying to these high standards. I won't do that because that would break my relationship with my God. So Joseph shows that he's guided by moral standards, by trust and fidelity, and most importantly, his relationship with his God. But Rosenblatt points out that the virtue of self-restraint is a virtue that prevents one from acting impulsively from one's passions and feelings, but one has self-restraint in order to reflect upon the possible consequences of actions and reflect on ways to negotiate the situation if there are any options. So this self-restraint is a very important leadership quality, she states, and also a way of understanding the delay of the gratification of one's hopes, dreams, desires is a very important part of self-restraint. So, self-restraint in leaders will be a very important role, not only in families, but also in nations and larger groups of people. When one has to exercise self-restraint in order to plan and to defer gratification of hopes and dreams. And we will see this virtue does help Joseph when he's empowered as viceroy over Egypt. It's the collecting and storing of the grain in order to and preserve it, and then when the famine comes, not to give it all away, but to regulate the distribution. Those are very important self-restraint options. But anyway, we get ahead of ourselves in that story. It's it's the dialogue about the situation at University of Oklahoma campus and the racial chant on the bus, and President Boren's response, or now some are saying reaction, that a decisive move needed to be made, but now the question is, did he not exercise a degree of self-restraint and exercise some due process? Did he react immediately like he should, but in how he reacted, did he overreact? Is now under discussion and evaluation. So anyway, the reason I mention that is this quality, he's a leader, and he's in a leadership position, and a situation presents itself. And then do you impulsively react only on your passions, or do you have some self-restraint and engage the mental processes? Now, passions in that, one of the things in our culture, anger is usually portrayed as a bad thing. Don't get angry. Calm down. Because often when we're angry, we overreact and we do and say things hurtful or counterproductively. However, anger does have a good side. If there is an injustice, if it does not make us angry, then we may not have the energy to do something about it. Anger energizes us. And so, but it can't be turned loose. Some of us have maybe experienced some anger turned loose where somebody is just angry and they're striking out at whoever is in their way. And that's not responsible. But if we don't have some passion from the anger about injustice, that it is wrong, if that anger isn't there to energize and motivate us, we may just do nothing and just let it continue. So the leadership quality of self-restraint gives time to process and make the right decisions about responses. But self-restraint doesn't always shield one from further hardship and adversity. he tries to do the right thing, but as we remember, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't, and he is going to be a situation that's powerless to escape it. His only recourse then was to endure and survive whatever would come next. He maintained his integrity, doing right and not yielding to the temptations. But as pointed out earlier, his integrity probably saved his life, because we suppose if Potiphar fully believed his wife's accusations, Joseph would have been summarily executed. But yet he's put in a prison, and more like a house arrest of sorts. So Potiphar, reading into it, seems to, has to show loyalty to his wife and also kind of cover up that he's got an unfaithful wife by blaming the slave for this situation. But yet, anyway, Joseph kept his integrity and probably saved his life, his own life in that case. But anyway, as Rosenblatt follows the story into prison, she suggests that the source of Joseph's resilience in these great calamities is his sense of God's covenant with him. The God of his fathers, the God of his faith, the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now his faith, because of what he's been taught in his home and because of this dream, he's believing that God is present and real with him, and that he has some chosen and special role that God has for him. So this identity, this sense of covenant and purpose, Rosenblatt is suggesting, is a part of that inner core, that sense of self that he's hanging on to, that helps him not cave into despair and bitterness and not give up hope or give up faith. It's kind of the thought or belief that regardless of what life brings, he must cling to this identity in order to be prepared someday for when this dream will come to fruition. I tried to think of an analogy of what that might be like, and right now they're forecasting. Again, the University of Oklahoma had like 4 quarterbacks who are in spring training, and they don't know who's going to be the one who gets the starting position. Now, a lot of times there are really talented and good athletes that will have to sit on the bench because somebody is just thought to be just a little better, or they might not be that much better, but given the offense and the other makeup of the team, they're a better fit this season with that other group of guys. And so this other talented person, or 2 or 3, has to sit on the bench and sit and wait. Now, you don't get fat and lazy sitting on the bench if you think and feel within your heart, if something happens to that guy, I can step in and I can do the job. So this inner self-confidence has that person sitting there waiting and ready. And when someone is in that position, they're reading every play. They're watching the defense. They're looking for, what would happen if I'm put in. I'm going to go in ready. So Joseph's is kind of in that position. I'm getting myself ready for when God calls me and puts me in this place of leadership, whatever it is to be. And so that is an important understanding maybe of what's going on within Joseph during this time when things just seem to go from bad to worse, but yet he keeps bouncing back. In the position in Potiphar's house, he earns the trust and is put in charge of everything except Potiphar's food and his wife. And then in the jail, he wins the trust of the head jailer, and he's put in charge of the other prisoners. And so he just kind of rises up. And so Rosenblatt, as a psychologist, is saying there's that inner core of his sense of self and purpose and destiny, as it were, that keeps him resilient, growing stronger, growing smarter, building confidence, and every time he can survive the next ordeal, he's gaining more wisdom and more inner strength. She points out that well, let's see. She was oh my gosh, no wonder I was having trouble. Remember, I got my cataract thing and I'm having trouble reading. This page 336 has a little tiny mark above the circle to make it a 6. And as I looked at it, it looks like 330. So I'm looking at page 330 and I can't find the quote that I'm looking for. But she quotes these folks as she's dealing with her next point she wants to make about the qualities that Joseph is growing. She says that throughout his trials in Egypt, Joseph refuses to forsake the covenant that his father and mother instilled in him at an early age, and despite the depths to which human treachery consigns him, he doesn't cave into despair or bitterness. And no matter how little control he wields over his fate, Joseph never relinquishes his moral integrity and his right to define his own spiritual identity. And then she quotes Viktor Frankl, who became a psychologist after surviving the Holocaust, and he had several other things that he said, but this quote that she finds for him, he says, "Men can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing. The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." We can choose what we're going to think about this. Now, in counseling, a lot of times that choosing, I will suggest to people, and other counselors if they use this, call it reframing. You can put a frame around this situation. You describe it, you paint a picture of this situation, and you can paint the frame around it, the ain't it awful, life ain't fair, how could they do this to me, where is God in all of this, God has abandoned me, and paint that frame around it. Or you can paint the frame around it that even though this is tough, I see the blessing in this, and I put the blessing in this. An example, I think this is probably okay to share. Ed Monette had fallen on the ice, and he's in rehab at St. Francis. And I was visiting with him and Marjorie, and she was saying, everything is just going so well. They are so kind to us, except for this one nurse, Nurse Cratchit. They've given her a nickname. And, she was expressing, that she was really frustrated and kind of upset about Nurse Cratchit. So that's the negative frame she's putting around that experience. And I said, Marjorie, let me suggest that you look at it this way. Since you're over here dealing with Ed all this time, you are not able to do your Lenten self-denial exercises to get ready for Easter, where we walk the path Jesus walked in his suffering and so forth. God has given you Nurse Cratchit to help you with your Lenten journey. And so we had a good laugh, and, she put that frame around it, and now when she thinks of Nurse Cratchit, instead of frowning and grimacing, now she smiles. And you'll see, Nurse Cratchit, well, you are God's gift to me. I'll put that frame around it. So it's doing that kind of thing. The attitude, you can take a choice and decide how you're going to look at something and choose your feelings about it. So, anyway, that's the truth that Viktor Frankl found, as he could tell who got eaten up by despair and bitterness and they died in prison, and who was able to put some different frame around the experience and have some reason to keep going and to survive and prevail. So, anyway, that's what she is. Maybe I can get this in. He doesn't give up in despair, and he doesn't, and he keeps doing the right thing a lot of times. And what he could have done, he could have been doing a lot of stupid things that would be self-defeating, making people mad at him and making his situation worse. But she suggests that he gains two other things, humility and empathy. And she comes to that conclusion in regard to his interpreting the dreams of the cupbearer and baker. She says he gives credit to God, not to his own ability. Now, remember, in the Egyptian culture, these dream interpreters was a big business. Lots of people dreamed. Lots of people would, charge you a nice fee to interpret your dreams for you. But he did not get into that commercial aspect of it. He says, not me. God has given me this ability to reveal to me what your dreams would mean. Now, we know the biblical writers want to attribute it all to God, but Rosenblatt looks a little deeper, and she says, we can't really know the heart and mind of Joseph, but we might wonder about his intent in giving his own God the recognition. Strategically, he could have blurred the reference just to some divine gift, but he's naming his God that he believed in, so he's making a religious statement, and he's risking conflict with saying, is my God's better than your God, because my God can do this. And so he's risking the religious conflict in order to make a stand, as it were. So not so much here, but when he interprets Pharaoh's dream, he really does say, my God is giving me this. But then that is the humility parts, not me, my God. But then back to the empathy, Joseph has developed empathy and a sensitivity to intuit and discern the anxieties and the fears affecting the baker and the cupbearer. He can read in their demeanor and their body language and their behavior and give him an ability to see something in their dreams to help him interpret them. Now, Rosenblatt is drawing upon her ability as a psychologist to read the body language and the ways people express things, because they will be revealing certain things about who they are and what they're afraid of and what they think and feel that they won't come right out and say, but are underneath. Anyway, so what he recognizes is that the cupbearer, in hand pressing the grape juice into Pharaoh's cup, is demonstrating a very personal and conscientious devotion to serving his master, Pharaoh. And so after Pharaoh cools down and gets over whatever he got mad about, he will probably restore the cupbearer to his position, because he will remember those qualities of personal attention and dedication. However, the fact that the baker was careless and left the breads unprotected from the birds of the air, then he was probably inattentive and giving a poor performance on his job, and the Pharaoh will judge him harshly and will be done with him. So humility and empathy, character traits that are very important for success, that he seems to be demonstrating in those situations. So for her, an interesting thing, again, either she's reading into the story from her perspective as a counselor, or her experience as a counselor is able to see something that the rest of us overlook, that she's able to perceive those qualities that he may have picked up on in those